In our last video, we installed the Faxination queue service in a dedicated active-passive cluster. Now we're going to move on to installing the kernel nodes in a load-balanced configuration. Overview for kernel node 1. We're going to go through the pre-installation. We're going to install the first node of the load-balanced cluster, pointing to the queue cluster during installation. We're going to go through post-installation steps. We're going to repeat for the second and subsequent nodes, and then we're going to configure the hardware load balancer. Pre-installation. If we'll be using the Faxination Web Service connector, you must install the Web Server IIS role in the operating system before the Faxination installation. Optionally, install GoScript for PDF conversion and OpenOffice for Office document conversion. Log on to the server that will become the first node of your load balance cluster using the Faxination service account. Launch the Faxination 2016 setup as usual. The installer will ask about the SQL resource again. Skip these dialogues just as you did for the queue installation. Save the licensing agreement and accept the terms just as we did before. You can accept the default installation path or specify your own. The installation drive must be a local drive, not a cluster resource, on each node. Do not activate during the installation. We will activate all of the cluster machines before we move on to the next step. And select the Advanced option. Select Local Kernel. Notice we're on the first load balance node, Faxination 01. Click Next. On the Server Components screen, keep the default selection of Tools and click Next. Your overall design and licensing will determine which host and device components you'll need to install inside the load balance cluster and which components will live outside. Just tick off any components that you wish to install and click Next. We're logged in using an account called Faxination SA, which is our Faxination service account. Here we'll need to provide the password for the service account so that we can create the Windows services. Click Next. This is the folder for the ActiveX controls. Again, these files should be installed locally and not on the cluster resource. If you have special installation requirements, it's okay to change this to another local folder. Otherwise, click Next. Enable network load balancing support and Faxination server. The central storage server is our existing queue cluster. Click Next. In our example, we've created an active-passive cluster called Queue Cluster. Click Next. Is this the installation of the first Faxination server for this IP load balancing configuration? Click Yes. We're shown the settings that we've configured for this installation. Confirm all of your folder paths. You should have the first two pointing to local paths and the second two pointing to UNC paths on the queue cluster. If everything looks okay, click Next. The installer will give you the chance to configure each of the host and device connector components that you've installed, followed by the kernel configuration. The configuration of the kernel node is the same as it would be for a standalone fax server, with the exception of the logging ID. This is a field that is typically ignored and only becomes useful when multiple kernels have been configured. Each time a job is processed and logged, the contents of this field are included as part of the log entry by default. That allows you to know which node processed a particular job for the purposes of troubleshooting. However, one of the new features of Faxination 2016 is that the kernel configuration is stored in a table in the FinMessaging SQL database. That means any configuration change made through an individual kernel node or through the Faxination Management Portal is automatically replicated across all of the kernel nodes. This logging ID field, however, is stored in the local registry so that each node can have its own unique logging ID. The setup on Node 1 is now complete. Go ahead and launch the Fenestre Server Administrator and make sure your services are starting okay before we move on to the next node. Now we log on to the server that will become Node 2 using the Faxination service account and run the installer just as we did before. The clustering support dialogues are all the same. Is this the installation of the first Faxination server for this IP load balancing configuration? Click No. Now we enter the name of the first kernel node. For us, this is Faxination 01. The configuration of Faxination 01 will be imported into this node, and they will share the same SQL resource. This completes Node 2. Just repeat these steps for any subsequent nodes, as many as you care to create. 2 or 3 nodes is typical for our largest customers with the highest fax volume. For post-installation, you'll recall from earlier in our training that there are scripts in the Fenestre kernel folder that set our document conversion options. Select Office Conversion lets us choose between the built-in generic document converter and OpenOffice for conversion of Office documents. Select PDF Conversion lets us choose between Adobe Acrobat, GoScript, and the generic document converter for PDF. One that we didn't mention previously is the Select PS Conversion script, which lets us choose between GoScript and the generic document converter for PostScript documents. In the latest Windows Server operating systems, you must run these scripts with elevated permissions. You can do this from a Launch as Administrator command prompt, or you can use the Select Conversion Elevated script to launch the other scripts automatically with elevated permissions. Back in the Fenestre Server Administrator on Node 1, launch the License Manager from the Tools section. When we launch the License Manager, we see there is already an activation key listed with a contract number and a system key. This is an evaluation key that was automatically generated by the installer that will expire in 30 days. At this point, all we need is the system key. Make a copy of it. When you purchase Faxination, you will receive a contract key from your Fenestre sales representative or Fenestre reseller. Take that contract key along with your system key and complete the product activation form on the Fenestre website, activation.fenestre.com. You will receive one or more license keys via email. It's important to remove your evaluation key when you add your true activation keys. Mixing of the two will cause problems. The number of activation keys that you will receive will vary from 1 to 6 keys or even more. All of the keys will arrive in a single email and must be applied to the fax server together. At this point, we have 2 or more Faxination kernel nodes configured. They are fully functional, but they can only be addressed individually. They don't yet exist within a cluster. We'll use a hardware load balancer to create the cluster and distribute inbound jobs to those nodes. The load balancer you choose is probably the one that you already use in your organization and one that you're familiar with. These are just the popular brands that we often see deployed at customer sites. Now, frankly, the configuration of the load balancer is outside of our jurisdiction. We don't resell load balancers, and we are not specifically trained to support them. But we will give you the general information that you need to know when configuring them for the Faxination load balancing. The load balancer needs to distribute incoming port 25 requests for SMTP email. This is TCP. Any remote Faxination host or device connectors will communicate inbound with the kernels on TCP port 53080. The Faxination Management Portal uses a REST interface that listens on TCP port 18371. The new Faxination REST connector listens on TCP port 18385. The Faxination Web Service Connector uses standard TCP port 80, just like normal HTTP communication. If you have fax over IP devices within the cluster, you'll need to forward port 5060 for SIP and ports 1503 and 1720 for H323. You may also need to forward additional ports or port ranges, either UDP or TCP, depending on your specific configuration and environment. Note that these are all the default non-secure ports. You can change them if you need to, such as when you need to enable SSL. The important thing to understand is that these are all inbound communication ports to the Faxination kernel. To distribute inbound requests, the load balancer has to be aware of these ports. You're only concerned with inbound ports. Outbound communication will come from the nodes themselves, and the load balancer isn't involved. And finally, when you have a host or device connector outside of the cluster communicating with the kernels through the load balancer, you will want to disable the Maintain Kernel Connection option. Normally, it's more efficient for a connector to stay connected to the kernel rather than negotiating a new connection each time, especially in high-volume environments. But in the case of load balancing, we don't want an external connector to fixate on any particular kernel inside the cluster. Proper load balancing requires the connections to be able to move freely between all of the available kernels within the cluster.